Okay. Thanks, Colin. Thanks for the time. I'm going to be speaking briefly about the two amendments that Bill 96 proposes. Et je vais parler en anglais, mais je suis parfaitement prêt à répondre aux questions s'il y en a en français. Section 159 of the bill states categorically that the Constitution Act of 1867 is amended by the following. Quebecers form a nation, and French shall be the only official language of Quebec. Note the wording. Bill 96 does not say Quebec will seek amendments to the Canadian Constitution. It declares that they're already in place. Now, some critics of Anglo rights activists like me criticize us for being angry or mean-spirited or even radical for questioning the notion of Quebec as a nation. What question I intend to do? So I pose it. What does forming a nation mean? Can it mean a nation in the juridical sense? Well, Quebec does not have a seat at the UN. Quebec is not recognized by any international body as a nation. So Quebec cannot claim to be, in the juridical sense, a nation. Perhaps in the aspirational sense, but Canada's Constitution is no place to enshrine separatist aspirations. If not in the juridical sense, can the word nation be construed in the ethno-linguistic sense? Quebec is a nation in that sociological sense. I would argue no. Quebecers are too plural to claim a single ethno-linguistic identity. There are just too many varied Quebecers. Stephen Harper's legislation in 2006 suggested that les Québécois formed a nation inside of Canada, but I would argue that even that was a misnomer, was wrong. The ethno-linguistic nation is really French Canadians, but they exceed the boundaries of Quebec by far. They're in all parts of Canada. They can claim to be an ethno-linguistic nation, as Pierre Trudeau suggested, but not Quebec in and of itself. Is it possible to construe the nation in a civic sense, meaning people who share common history, laws, and traditions? Is Quebec a nation in that sense? Even there are major problems. The question, who else in Canada might qualify, needs to be asked. Is the Yukon Territory a nation, therefore? Can they jump from being a territory to claim nationhood based on a very different history, a sense of law and tradition that are all different in that part of Canada? Can Newfoundland and Labrador claim to be a nation? They were, after all, at a certain point in history, before 1949, their own separate jurisdiction. Can municipalities within Quebec claim to be nations because they have separate histories, laws, and traditions? This begs the question, where does a jurisdiction end and a nation begin? Quebec as a nation, even in the civic sense, is too vague and amorphous a concept to enshrine in the Constitution of our country. Now, note the method of amending the Constitution that Quebec has chosen: unilateralism. The distinct society concept in the Charlottetown Accord was contentious enough. Quebec as a nation is even more so. Canadians as a whole are affected by the importation of so radical a term into Canada's Constitution. So such an amendment cannot be effected by Quebec alone and likely requires at least 7 provinces representing 50% of the population of Canada to agree. Now let me turn to the language question. The Second Amendment, French shall be the only official language of Quebec. I would like to stress, this question has already been litigated almost 40 years ago in the two Blakey cases that went already up to the Supreme Court of Canada. All the arguments the Quebec government is presenting for these two amendments have already been presented and rejected at the highest court of the land. For example, 40 years ago, the separatist government of the day presented an aspect of its language legislation, Bill 101, which said French is the language of the legislature and the courts in Quebec. I'll read it again. French is the language of the legislature and the courts in Quebec. I don't see how that differs substantially from French shall be the only official language of Quebec. But 40 years ago, the judges wrote that that statement was a flagrant contradiction of Section 133 of Canada's Constitution. Not just a contradiction, but a flagrant contradiction. And the whole notion of French being the language of the legislature and the courts in Quebec was rejected. It was also rejected, the argument was made by the provincial government at the time, and I will read what they said. It was the contention of the appellant, that is the Quebec government, that the language of the legislature and of the courts of Quebec is part of the constitution of the province, and hence is within the unilateral amending or modifying authority of the legislature under Section 92(1). The judges wrote that and rejected Quebec government's contention that this amendment fell under the province's constitution alone. I repeat, the question has been litigated already at the highest court level of the land. So what does it mean for our society when a government refuses to accept the rulings of a court? It means the erosion of the rule of law, the disruption of settled judicial rulings. It means, I would argue, contempt of court and the breakdown of peace, order, and good government. Now, note it was a private citizen who had to defend his community's constitutional rights in 1982. Peter Blakey had to go before the courts. That job should have fallen to the federal government, but instead they chose to abscond. The question arises, how often do private citizens in Quebec have to step up to defend the same rights the courts have already expressly validated? Once every generation? More? And what should we call such governmental misbehavior? The deliberate adoption of agent provocateur legislation. They know what the decision was 40 years ago. They know that their argument that this fell under the province's constitution was rejected. And they know that the argument that French is the language of the legislature and the courts in Quebec has been rejected. Why not we call this a perverse, if sophisticated form of judicial harassment? Surely there ought to be penalties for governments which engage in this practice.